The bullet that grazed Willa Sawyer's wagon wheel on that scorching August afternoon in 1878 wasn't meant for her, but it changed everything nonetheless. She had been traveling alone from Dodge City, Kansas to Kingston, New Mexico territory, a journey that her father had warned against but which she'd undertaken anyway after receiving word that her aunt had fallen ill. The shot came from somewhere in the rocky outcropping to her left, followed by shouting and the thunder of hooves. Willa pulled hard on the reins, her heart hammering as her two horses whinnied and stamped nervously. Three men on horseback burst from behind a cluster of juniper trees, pursued by a lone rider on a magnificent black stallion. The lone rider sat tall in his saddle, his movements fluid and controlled despite the breakneck speed. He wore a dark hat pulled low, and even from a distance, Willa could see the glint of a badge on his chest. The three men ahead of him were firing wildly over their shoulders, their aim poor but their intent deadly. One of the shots must have been what struck her wheel. Willa did the only sensible thing she could think of. She grabbed her father's rifle from beneath the seat, stood up in the wagon, braced herself against the buckboard, and fired a shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the desert landscape, and all four riders looked her way. In that moment of distraction, the lawman closed the distance. He fired once, twice, and one of the fleeing men tumbled from his horse. The other two split up, one heading east toward the distant mountains, the other circling back. The lawman made his choice instantly, pursuing the one who circled back. They disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving Willa standing in her wagon, rifle still raised, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The wounded outlaw lay motionless on the ground about 50 yards away. His horse had stopped and was grazing peacefully, as if men didn't regularly fall from its back in violent fashion. Minutes passed like hours. The August sun beat down mercilessly, and Willa finally lowered her rifle, her arms trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. She climbed down from the wagon and checked her wheel. The bullet had gouged a chunk from the wooden rim but hadn't broken through. She could still make it to Kingston if she went slowly. The sound of returning hooves made her spin around, rifle raised again. But it was only the lawman, returning alone. He slowed as he approached, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. His other hand held the reins loosely, and Willa noticed he wore his gun low on his hip, the way men did when they knew how to use it. "Easy there, miss," he called out. His voice was deep and steady, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. "I'm Marshal Franklin Preston, out of Kingston." "You hurt?" Willa lowered the rifle slowly. "No, sir, just startled." "What was all that about?" Marshal Preston dismounted in one smooth motion and approached, removing his hat. He was younger than Willa had expected, probably no more than 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw and dust covered his clothes, but there was something inherently trustworthy about his face. "Those men robbed the bank in Cimarron 3 days ago," he explained. "Killed a clerk in the process. I've been tracking them since. I'm sorry about your wheel. I'll pay for the repairs once we get to Kingston." "You're assuming that's where I'm headed," Willa said, though she couldn't quite keep the relief from her voice. She'd been alone on this road for 2 days, and the thought of traveling the final stretch with a marshal was more comforting than she wanted to admit. "Well, this road doesn't go much of anywhere else, and Kingston's the only town for another 40 miles. Franklin Preston smiled then, and it transformed his serious face entirely. "Unless you're planning to set up camp in the desert, which I wouldn't recommend in August." Despite herself, Willa smiled back. "Kingston it is. I'm Willa Sawyer. I'm going to care for my Aunt Josephine Sawyer." She owns the dress shop there. Recognition flickered in Franklin's eyes. Miss Josephine, fine woman. I'm sorry to hear she's poorly. Let me just check on that outlaw and then I'll ride with you into town. Won't take but a moment. He walked over to where the man lay and knelt beside him. Even from a distance, Willa could tell from the set of Franklin's shoulders that he'd found the man dead. Franklin stood, removed his hat briefly in what might have been a prayer, then walked to catch the dead man's horse. He tied the body across the saddle with practiced efficiency, the movements of someone who'd done this before and taken no pleasure in it. When he returned to Willa's wagon, his expression was somber. "I'll need to bring him in. Do you mind the company of the dead?" "I've seen death before, Marshal. My mother passed 2 years ago and I helped prepare her for burial. I'm not afraid of it." Something in Franklin's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, and please call me Franklin. Marshal makes me feel like my father, and he was the one who actually deserved the title." They traveled together through the afternoon, the pace slow to accommodate Willa's damaged wheel. Franklin rode alongside the wagon, leading the horse with its grim burden. At first they rode in silence, but as the miles passed, conversation came easier. "Have you been Marshal long?" Willa asked, partly to distract herself from the stiffness in her back from the hard wagon seat, partly because she found herself genuinely curious about this quiet, competent man. "Just over a year. My father was Marshal before me. He died in a shootout with cattle rustlers. The town council asked me to take his place." Franklin's voice remained steady, but Willa heard the grief underneath. "I'd been his deputy for 3 years, so I knew the work. Didn't mean I felt ready for it." "I don't think anyone ever feels ready for the things that matter most," Willa said softly. "I wasn't ready when Mama died. I'm not sure I'm ready now to see Aunt Josephine so ill, but we do what we must." Franklin looked at her with something like understanding. "Your father, is he still living?" "Yes, but his health isn't what it was. That's why I'm traveling alone. He couldn't make the journey and we couldn't afford to hire someone to accompany me. My 2 brothers are working a cattle drive in Texas, won't be back until October." Willa adjusted the reins in her hands. "Papa didn't want me to go, said it was too dangerous for a woman alone. I suppose he was right, given what happened today." "You handled yourself well," Franklin said. "That shot you fired gave me the opening I needed. If you hadn't done that, I might not have caught them. You only caught one. 2 out of 3 is better than none. I've sent telegrams to marshals in Colorado and Arizona. They'll be watching for the other 2. Franklin's jaw tightened. "They'll be caught eventually. Men like that always are." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Kingston came into view. It wasn't a large town, but it looked prosperous enough, with a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above them, and homes scattered on the outskirts. Willa felt a wave of relief at the sight. "I'll take you to your aunt's place first," Franklin said. "Then I need to deal with this business." He gestured to the body he was transporting. "But I'd like to check on you tomorrow if that's all right. Make sure you and Miss Josephine have everything you need." "That would be kind of you," Willa said, and meant it. Aunt Josephine's home was a neat white house with blue shutters on the quieter end of Main Street. The dress shop occupied the front room, with living quarters in the back and upstairs. Franklin helped Willa down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist, and for a moment their eyes met. Willa felt something spark between them, quick as lightning and just as electric. "Thank you for your help today, Franklin," she said. "It was my privilege, Willa." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll see you tomorrow." Willa watched him ride away, leading the outlaw's horse, before turning to knock on her aunt's door. It opened almost immediately, revealing not her aunt but a stout woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "You must be Willa," the woman said warmly. "I'm Margaret Harris, your aunt's neighbor. I've been looking after her. Come in, dear. She's been so anxious for you to arrive." Aunt Josephine was indeed ill, confined to her bed upstairs with a persistent fever and cough that the doctor had diagnosed as pneumonia. But her eyes lit up when she saw Willa, and she reached out with trembling hands. "My girl," she whispered. "You came." "Of course I came," Willa said, taking her aunt's hands gently. They felt hot and dry, like paper left too long in the sun. "I'm here now, and I'm going to take care of you until you're well again." Over the next 2 weeks, Willa settled into a routine. She woke early to tend to her aunt, preparing broths and teas, keeping the room cool and comfortable, reading aloud when Josephine was awake enough to listen. In the afternoons, when her aunt slept, Willa worked in the dress shop, helping the few customers who came by and trying to keep the business running. Mrs. Harris helped as much as she could, bringing meals and sitting with Josephine when Willa needed to rest. Franklin came by every day, always finding some reason. The first day he brought the money for the wagon wheel repair. The second day he brought fresh eggs from a farm outside town. The third day he brought wildflowers he claimed to have found on his morning ride. By the end of the first week, he'd stopped making excuses and simply came because he wanted to see her. They would sit on the front porch in the early evening when the heat of the day had passed, and talk. Franklin told her about growing up in Kingston, about learning to track and shoot from his father, about the weight of wearing a badge in a territory where law was still a fragile, precious thing. Willa told him about her life in Dodge City, about helping her father run his general store, about the books she loved to read, and the dreams she'd had of seeing more of the world before her mother's death had anchored her to home and duty. "You still have those dreams?" Franklin asked one evening. They were sitting side by side on the porch steps, close enough that Willa could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to follow him. "Sometimes," Willa admitted, "but dreams change, I think. What I wanted at 18 isn't what I want at 22. Now I think I'd be content with a good life, with people I love around me, with work that matters." "That doesn't sound like settling," Franklin said. "That sounds like wisdom." Willa looked at him, at the way the fading sunlight caught in his dark hair, at the strong lines of his face and the gentleness in his eyes. "What about you? What do you dream of?" Franklin was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I dream of days when I don't have to strap on a gun. When this territory is tame enough that we don't need marshals tracking killers across the desert. I dream of having land of my own, maybe raising horses, and I dream of having someone to share it all with." He turned to look at her directly. "Someone brave and kind and beautiful. Someone exactly like you." Willa's breath caught. "Franklin, we've only known each other 2 weeks." "I know." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just telling you what's in my heart." Inside the house, Aunt Josephine began coughing. Willa stood quickly, though she kept hold of Franklin's hand for a moment longer. "I need to go to her. I know. I'll see you tomorrow." "Yes, tomorrow." That night, as Willa sat beside her aunt's bed, spooning medicine between the older woman's lips, Josephine opened her eyes and looked at her with surprising clarity. "That Marshal," she whispered. "He's courting you." Willa felt her cheeks warm. "Aunt Josephine, you should rest." "I may be sick, but I'm not blind. He's a good man, Willa. His father was the finest marshal this town ever had, and Franklin's cut from the same cloth. If he set his sights on you, you could do far worse." "It's too soon to think about such things," Willa protested, but her heart wasn't in it. "Love doesn't follow a timetable," Josephine said. I met my Henry at a barn dance and married him 3 weeks later. We had 27 good years before the fever took him. Not a one of them wasted." She squeezed Willa's hand with surprising strength. "Don't let fear keep you from happiness, girl." As August gave way to September, Aunt Josephine slowly began to recover. The fever broke, the cough eased, and color returned to her cheeks. Willa felt a weight lift from her shoulders, one she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. And as her aunt improved, Willa found herself with more time to spend with Franklin. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon, providing a gentle mare from the livery stable. They rode out beyond the town, into the rolling hills covered in juniper and pinyon pine. Franklin showed her a place where a creek ran cold and clear, where cottonwood trees provided shade and the only sounds were wind and water and birdsong. "I come here when I need to think," he told her, helping her down from the horse. "When the weight of the badge gets too heavy." They sat by the creek, and Franklin told her about the men he'd tracked, the violence he'd witnessed, the times he'd questioned whether he was making any difference at all. Willa listened, understanding that he needed to speak these things aloud, to share the burden he carried. "You make a difference," she said firmly. "Every person who can sleep safely at night because you're watching over them, that's a difference. Every family who doesn't have to fear outlaws and killers, that's because of men like you." Franklin looked at her with such tenderness that Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" "You shot near my wagon wheel," Willa said, and they both laughed. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, his hand cupping her cheek. Willa felt the world fall away, felt everything narrow down to this moment, this man, this feeling of rightness that filled her chest until she thought she might burst with it. When they finally pulled apart, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Willa Sawyer. I know it's fast, and I know you have a life back in Dodge City, but I'm asking anyway. Marry me and make your life here, with me." Willa's heart raced. Everything logical in her mind said it was too soon, too fast, too impulsive. But her heart, her stubborn, foolish heart, knew the truth. She'd fallen in love with this quiet, brave man who carried the weight of his father's legacy, and his own integrity with equal measure. She'd fallen in love with his gentleness and his strength, with the way he looked at her like she was something precious, with the future she could see so clearly when she looked into his eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Franklin's whoop of joy startled the horses and sent birds flying from the trees. He picked Willa up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, and Willa felt the promise in it, the commitment, the forever. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church on Main Street. Aunt Josephine, fully recovered and radiating joy, stood as Willa's witness. The town doctor, who also served as mayor, stood up for Franklin. Half the town attended, curious to see their Marshal wed, and charmed by the story of how he'd quite literally ridden to Willa's rescue. Willa wore a dress that she and her aunt had sewn together. Simple but elegant cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She'd woven wildflowers into her hair, the same kind Franklin had brought her that second day. Franklin wore his Sunday best, a black suit that made him look both distinguished and slightly uncomfortable, though his eyes never left Willa as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Franklin slid the simple gold band onto Willa's finger, his voice was steady and sure. "With this ring I thee wed. All that I am I give to you. All that I have I share with you. Whatever the future brings, we face it together." Willa repeated the words, sliding a matching band onto Franklin's finger, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared felt like a vow all its own. The celebration afterward was held in the town hall, with tables laden with food that neighbors had contributed, and a fiddler who played while couples danced. Franklin proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, leading Willa through reels and waltzes with easy confidence. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless and laughing. "My mother insisted," Franklin said. "She said a man needed to know how to dance, how to cook a decent meal, and how to sew on a button if he wanted to survive on his own." Never thought I'd be grateful for the dancing lessons until now. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Franklin leaned close to whisper in Willa's ear. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Preston?" The title sent a thrill through her. "Yes, Mr. Preston, I am." They'd found a small house at the edge of town. Nothing fancy but solid and theirs. Franklin had spent the past week making it ready, painting the walls, fixing the porch steps, even building a bookshelf in the parlor when Willa had mentioned her love of reading. It wasn't much, but as Franklin carried her over the threshold and set her gently on her feet, Willa thought she'd never seen anywhere more beautiful. The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Willa helped her aunt in the dress shop 3 days a week, both because Josephine still needed the help and because Willa enjoyed the work. She discovered she had a talent for intricate embroidery, and soon women were specifically requesting her services for special pieces. Franklin continued his work as marshal, though Willa lived in constant low-grade fear every time he rode out after outlaws or to settle disputes. He always came home to her, though, sometimes tired, sometimes troubled, but always hers. They built a life together piece by piece, learning each other's habits and rhythms, figuring out how to share space and dreams and a future. Winter came to the New Mexico territory, not as harsh as the winters Willa remembered from Kansas, but cold enough. Franklin taught her to shoot properly, saying any woman married to a lawman needed to know how to defend herself. They would ride out to a secluded spot and practice, and Willa discovered she had a good eye and steady hands. "You're a natural," Franklin said proudly after she hit the target dead center 3 times in a row. "Remind me never to make you angry." "Too late," Willa teased. "I'm furious that you ate the last piece of apple pie this morning." Franklin pulled her close, nuzzling her neck. "Let me make it up to you. You'll have to bake another pie. I had something else in mind." They didn't get much more shooting practice done that afternoon. Christmas came and went, their first as a married couple. Willa spent weeks working on a special project, embroidering Franklin's initials onto a fine white handkerchief. She'd chosen deep blue thread that matched his eyes and worked the letters in an elegant script, surrounding them with a pattern of small stars. It was delicate work, requiring patience and precision, but Willa poured her love into every stitch. On Christmas morning, she gave him the handkerchief wrapped in simple brown paper. Franklin unwrapped it carefully, his expression puzzled until he saw what she'd made. He held it up to the light, examining the embroidery, and Willa saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Willa, this is beautiful. You made this." "I wanted you to have something of mine when you're out there," she said softly. "Something to remind you to come home safe." Franklin pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I will always come home to you. Always." He disappeared into their bedroom then, and when he returned, he had the handkerchief and a small sewing kit. Willa watched, curious, as he threaded a needle with the same blue thread she'd used and began to carefully add to her embroidery. His stitches weren't as neat as hers, but they were careful and deliberate. When he finished and held up the handkerchief, Willa saw he'd added her initials right beside his. "Now we match forever," Franklin said, his voice rough with emotion. "Wherever I go, I carry both of us. We're together always, Willa, in every way that matters." Willa felt tears spill down her cheeks. She took the handkerchief gently, tracing the letters with her finger. His initials and hers intertwined in blue thread, a tangible symbol of their joined lives. It was perfect. Spring of 1879 brought news that made Willa both anxious and excited. She was pregnant, due to deliver in the fall. Franklin was overjoyed, though his protectiveness increased tenfold. He worried about her working too hard, tried to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup, and generally drove her to distraction with his hovering. "Franklin Preston, I am having a baby, not dying of consumption," she told him exasperatedly one morning when he tried to prevent her from hanging laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I'm perfectly capable of hanging sheets." "I know, but I just want to make sure you're safe, both of you." He placed his hand gently on her still flat belly. "I've never been a father before. I don't know what I'm doing." Willa's annoyance melted away. She covered his hand with hers. "None of us do, not the first time. We'll figure it out together." As spring turned to summer and summer began its slow slide toward fall, Willa's belly grew round and full. She had to give up riding, which she missed, but she threw herself into preparing for the baby. She and Aunt Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Franklin built a cradle that rocked gently when you touched it, crafted with such care that Willa cried when she saw it. Mrs. Harris contributed advice, most of it contradictory, but all of it well-meaning. The baby came on an October evening when the air had finally begun to cool. Willa's labor started just after supper, and Franklin immediately went into a controlled panic. He sent for the doctor, for Mrs. Harris, for Aunt Josephine, and then proceeded to pace the kitchen floor like a caged animal while the women attended to Willa upstairs. It was long and hard, the way first labors often are. Willa had never experienced pain like this, waves of it that threatened to drown her. But between contractions, Mrs. Harris would wipe her face with a cool cloth, and Aunt Josephine would tell her she was doing wonderfully. And eventually, as the sun began to rise on a new day, the baby finally came. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, and moments later, Willa heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her son's first cry. They laid him on her chest, this tiny, perfect creature with a shock of dark hair and his father's nose. Willa couldn't stop looking at him, couldn't believe that she and Franklin had created something so miraculous. "Can I come in?" Franklin's voice came from outside the door, tentative and hopeful. "Come meet your son," Willa called, her voice hoarse but happy. Franklin came in slowly, his eyes wide with wonder. He approached the bed like he was walking on holy ground, and when he looked down at his son, tears streamed unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," Franklin whispered. "You're perfect. I can't believe he's ours. What should we name him?" Willa asked. They discussed names but never quite settled on one. Franklin was quiet for a moment, his finger gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. "What about Thomas? After your father?" Willa felt her heart swell. "Thomas Franklin Preston. It's perfect." Thomas was a good baby, as babies go, though he had strong opinions about when he wanted to eat and sleep. Willa and Franklin stumbled through those first weeks in an exhausted haze, learning how to soothe their son's cries, how to change diapers with fumbling fingers, how to be parents. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. Franklin had to return to his marshal duties after 2 weeks, though he hated to leave Willa alone with the baby. But crime didn't stop just because a lawman became a father, and the territory still needed protecting. Willa managed well enough with help from Aunt Josephine and Mrs. Harris, and she discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. One evening when Thomas was about 2 months old, Willa was nursing him in the rocking chair by the fireplace when Franklin came home. He'd been gone 3 days tracking a horse thief, and he looked exhausted, but his face lit up when he saw his wife and son. "I missed you both," he said, kissing Willa and then gently stroking Thomas's head. How was he? Perfect, as always. Though he did spit up on Aunt Josephine's best dress yesterday, she was very gracious about it. Willa looked up at her husband, noting the lines of weariness around his eyes. Are you all right? Just tired. It was a long ride. Franklin sat down heavily in the chair across from her. I caught the thief, but I keep thinking about what you said last Christmas, about coming home safe. Every time I ride out now, I think about what I'd be leaving behind if something happened. It makes me more careful, but it also makes the work harder somehow. You regret it? Being a marshal now that you're a father? No, Franklin's answer was immediate and firm. But I think about the future more, about what I want for Thomas, for you, for us. I've been thinking maybe it's time to consider something else. Maybe run for sheriff, which would keep me closer to home. Or maybe I could get into ranching like I always dreamed. I've saved up some money and we could start small. Willa felt hope bloom in her chest. You'd really give up being marshal? I'd give up anything if it meant more time with you and Thomas. My father died wearing a badge, and I used to think that was the most honorable thing a man could do. But now, I think the most honorable thing I can do is watch my son grow up and grow old with the woman I love. Franklin reached over and took her hand. I'm not saying it would be tomorrow. I need to train a replacement, make sure the town is in good hands, but within the year I'd like to make a change. Then we'll make it work, Willa said. Whatever you decide, we'll make it work together. The next months confirmed Franklin's decision. There was a shootout in front of the saloon that left one man dead and Franklin with a bullet graze across his ribs. He came home bleeding, trying to downplay the injury, but Willa saw the truth in his eyes. He'd been shaken by how close it had been. I need to finish this, he said, as Willa bandaged his wound. I need to see it through properly. But then I'm done, Willa. I'm going to hand in my badge and start living a life that doesn't involve getting shot at. True to his word, Franklin began training his deputy, a competent young man named Samuel Wright, to take over as marshal. He also started looking at land outside of town, places where they could build a ranch. On weekends, when he wasn't working, he and Willa would drive out with Thomas to look at properties, dreaming about the future they would build. They found the perfect place in the spring of 1880, 160 acres with good grazing land, a creek running through it, and a small existing cabin that could be expanded. The owners were an older couple moving back east to be near their daughter, and they gave Franklin a fair price. He used every cent of his savings and borrowed a bit more from the bank, but by April the land was theirs. This is where we'll build our life, Franklin said, standing with Willa on a small rise that overlooked the property. Thomas was on his father's hip, chewing contentedly on his fist. This is where Thomas will grow up, where his brothers and sisters will play. This is home. Brothers and sisters? Willa asked, amused. How many children are you planning on? As many as God blesses us with and you're willing to have, Franklin said, grinning. I was thinking maybe 4 or 5. 4 or 5. You're not the one who has to birth them, Franklin Preston. True. So how many would you like? Willa looked out over the land at the cottonwoods along the creek and the mountains in the distance. She thought about Thomas and imagined other children, a house full of life and laughter and love. Let's start with one more and see how we feel. Franklin kissed her temple. Deal. In June of 1880, Franklin officially resigned as marshal, handing his badge over to Samuel with his blessing and the town council's approval. There was a ceremony, speeches about Franklin's service and his father's legacy, a gift of money from grateful townspeople. Franklin accepted it all with grace, but Willa could see the relief in his eyes. He was finally free to become the man he wanted to be rather than living in his father's shadow. They moved to the ranch in July, and the work began in earnest. Franklin proved to be as good at ranching as he'd been at marshaling, though the learning curve was steep. He bought a small herd of cattle and some horses he planned to breed and train. Willa kept chickens and started a large garden. They hired 2 ranch hands, both older men with experience, who lived in a small bunkhouse Franklin built behind the main cabin. The cabin itself they expanded over time, adding rooms as they needed them. Franklin did most of the work himself, though neighbors came to help with the bigger projects. The ranch community was tight-knit and supportive, and Willa found herself making friendships that would last a lifetime. Thomas grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler who wanted to help with everything. Franklin was an attentive, patient father, teaching his son about horses and cattle, letting him help with chores even when it made everything take twice as long. Watching them together made Willa's heart ache with happiness. True to their plans, Willa discovered she was pregnant again in the fall of 1880. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She carried well and continued working on the ranch until the last few weeks. Their daughter was born in May of 1881, arriving quickly and with far less drama than Thomas's birth. They named her Caroline, after Franklin's mother, and she was a placid, content baby who seemed happy as long as she was fed and dry. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her and help take care of her. The 4 of them settled into family life with surprising ease. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Franklin proved to have an eye for good horses, and his reputation for breeding quality stock spread throughout the territory. Willa's garden provided more vegetables than they could use, so she started selling the surplus in town. Between the horses, cattle, and Willa's garden, they made a good living, better than they'd expected. They had 2 more children, another boy in 1883 whom they named William, and finally another daughter in 1885 whom they called Sarah. Their home was loud and chaotic and full of love. Franklin had left behind the dangers of law enforcement, but found new purpose in raising his family and building his ranch. Willa had never been happier. One evening in the summer of 1886, after the children were finally asleep and the ranch work was done for the day, Willa and Franklin sat together on the porch they'd built onto the front of the cabin. It had become their habit, this evening time together, a chance to reconnect after busy days spent meeting the demands of ranch and family. "You remember that day we met?" Franklin asked. He was whittling a toy horse for William, his hands sure and steady with the knife. "When I was chasing those bank robbers, how could I forget? You shot my wagon wheel," Willa said, smiling. "I was terrified." "You didn't look terrified. You looked like you were ready to take on the whole world with that rifle. That's when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were the woman I'd been waiting for. Someone who wouldn't fall apart in a crisis. Someone strong and brave and true." Franklin set down his whittling and took Willa's hand. "Someone exactly like you." Willa laced her fingers through his, feeling the familiar calluses from ranch work, so different from the gun calluses he used to have. "I knew, too, that first evening on Aunt Josephine's porch. I knew you were going to change my life. Any regrets?" "Not a single one." "You?" "Only that I didn't meet you sooner so we could have had more time together." Franklin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Though I suppose we have plenty of time ahead of us still. Many more years, God willing," Willa agreed. "Watching our children grow up, maybe seeing grandchildren someday." "Thomas wants to be a rancher like his old man," Franklin said proudly. "Asked me the other day when he could start breaking horses on his own. He's only 5 years old." "Caroline wants to be a dress designer like her great-aunt Josephine," Willa added. She spends hours drawing pictures of dresses and showing them to me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold as it sank toward the mountains. From inside the house came a sudden wail, quickly shushed. Sarah, their youngest, had probably woken from a dream. "I'll go," Franklin said, but Willa put a hand on his arm. "Let me. You've been up since before dawn." She stood and kissed the top of his head. "Don't stay up too late. We have a full day tomorrow." "Willa," Franklin called as she reached the door. She turned back. "I love you, more than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." It was something he said often, a promise renewed each day. "I love you too, Franklin, forever." Inside, Sarah had already fallen back asleep, her thumb in her mouth and her other hand clutching the rag doll Aunt Josephine had made her. Willa adjusted the blanket and stood watching her daughter sleep, marveling as she always did at the miracle of her children. She checked on the others too, a nightly ritual she never skipped. William was sprawled across his bed, covers kicked off, one arm hanging over the side. Willa covered him gently. Caroline slept curled in a neat ball, her dark hair spread across the pillow. And Thomas, her firstborn, slept with the toy horse his father had carved him clutched in one hand. Satisfied that all was well, Willa returned to the porch. Franklin had finished his whittling and was sitting with his head tipped back, looking at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "All quiet?" he asked as she sat back down beside him. "All quiet." Sarah was already back asleep. Franklin put his arm around Willa's shoulders and she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, the same heart that had chosen her 8 years ago on a dusty road in the New Mexico territory. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For everything. For rescuing me, for loving me, for giving me this life. For being exactly who you are." Franklin tightened his arm around her. "I should be thanking you. Before you, I was just going through the motions, living up to what I thought everyone expected of me. You showed me what it meant to actually live, to choose happiness instead of just accepting whatever came. You gave me permission to want more than just duty and responsibility." "We gave each other that," Willa said. "We built this life together, piece by piece. Every choice, every challenge, every joy, together." "Together," Franklin echoed. "Always together." They sat like that as the stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and from the barn, one of the horses whinnied softly in response. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the scent of sage and grass and home. "Do you remember what you said to me that day at the creek?" Willa asked. "When you proposed?" "I remember every word. I said I'd found someone brave and kind and beautiful, someone exactly like you. You also said you dreamed of days when the territory would be tame enough that we wouldn't need marshals tracking killers. Do you think we'll see that day?" Franklin considered the question. "I think we're seeing the beginning of it. More people settling, more towns growing, more law taking hold. It won't happen overnight, but yes, I think we'll see it. Maybe not in our lifetime, but our children will. They'll live in a world a little safer, a little more civilized than the one we knew. I hope so. I want that for them. I want them to grow up without fear, to build their own lives and follow their own dreams." Willa paused. "Though I have to admit, I'm glad I got to live through these times. Wild as they were, dangerous as they were, they gave me you." "They gave us each other," Franklin corrected. "And I wouldn't trade that for anything, not even a perfectly tame and civilized world." As the years continued to pass, the Preston Ranch became one of the most respected in the territory. Franklin's horses were sought after throughout New Mexico and beyond, known for their intelligence and temperament. The cattle operation expanded steadily, and they eventually bought additional land, bringing their total holdings to nearly 300 acres. The children grew like weeds. Thomas became his father's right hand on the ranch, showing an instinct for working with animals that made Franklin proud. Caroline's artistic talents extended beyond dress design to painting and drawing, and the walls of their home were covered with her work. William was the daredevil of the family, always climbing trees or racing his horse too fast, giving Willa heart palpitations regularly. And Sarah, sweet Sarah, proved to have a gift for music, singing like an angel and teaching herself to play the old piano Franklin had bought from a family moving back east. Aunt Josephine remained a constant presence in their lives, finally retiring from the dress shop in 1888 and moving to a small cottage on the ranch property. She'd become the beloved grandmother figure to all the Preston children, always ready with stories or cookies or wisdom when needed. Mrs. Harris had passed away in 1884, and Willa still missed her kindness and practical help. Kingston itself grew and changed. The railroad came through in 1887, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The town council talked about petitioning for statehood, though that was still years away. Samuel Wright proved to be an excellent marshal, keeping the peace with the same integrity Franklin had shown. He and Franklin remained good friends, often sitting together at church or sharing a drink at the saloon. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts that killed crops and forced them to sell cattle to survive. There were illnesses that swept through the family, keeping Willa up nights nursing sick children back to health. There was the year when a grass fire nearly destroyed everything they'd built, stopped only by Franklin and the ranch hands' desperate efforts to create a fire break. There were moments of fear and worry and doubt, but there was so much more joy. First steps and first words and first days of school. Christmas mornings with the children rushing downstairs to see what gifts awaited them. Summer evenings swimming in the creek, the children's laughter echoing off the water. Autumn rides through the mountains to see the aspens turn gold. Winter nights gathered around the fireplace, Franklin reading aloud while Willa mended clothes and the children played quietly. And through it all, Willa and Franklin's love deepened and matured like good wine. They were partners in every sense of the word, making decisions together, supporting each other's dreams, weathering storms side by side. They still found time for themselves, stealing moments of intimacy amid the chaos of family life, never taking for granted the bond that held them together. One evening in the autumn of 1890, Willa was in the kitchen preparing supper when Caroline came running in, breathless and excited. "Mama, Mama, Papa says to come quick. Thomas is going to try riding Lightning." Willa's heart jumped. Lightning was a young stallion Franklin had been training, beautiful but high-spirited. Thomas was 14 now, certainly old enough to handle a challenging horse, but Willa couldn't help the maternal fear that rose in her throat. She hurried outside to find Franklin and Thomas at the corral. Thomas was already mounted on Lightning, his face set in determined concentration. Franklin stood nearby, his posture relaxed but his attention entirely focused on his son. "You remember what I taught you," Franklin called. "He's going to test you. Don't let him know you're nervous. You're in charge, but your partner's too. Respect him and he'll respect you." Thomas nodded. He gathered the reins, took a deep breath, and gave Lightning a gentle squeeze with his legs. The horse took off like he'd been shot from a cannon, bucking and twisting. Willa gasped, but Thomas held on, his body moving with the horse's movements rather than fighting against them. After a few wild seconds, Lightning settled into a canter, then a trot, and finally walked calmly around the corral. Thomas was grinning ear to ear. "Did you see that? Did you see?" "I saw," Franklin said, pride evident in his voice. "You did good, son. Real good." Willa realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, allowing the fear to drain away. Her little boy wasn't so little anymore. None of them were. Time kept moving forward, bringing change with it, and all she could do was embrace it and trust that she and Franklin had given their children the tools they needed to face whatever came. That evening, after the children were in bed, Willa retrieved the handkerchief from the drawer where she kept it safe. It was 12 years old now, the fabric slightly yellowed, the blue thread faded to a softer shade. But the embroidery was still intact, Franklin's initials and hers intertwined forever. She traced the letters with her finger, remembering the Christmas morning she'd given it to him, remembering how he'd added her initials and said they'd match forever. He'd been right. They did match, not just in thread and fabric, but in every way that mattered. Their hearts beat in rhythm, their dreams aligned, their lives so thoroughly intertwined that Willa could no longer imagine where she ended and he began. "What are you doing?" Franklin asked, coming into their bedroom. He'd been checking the barn one last time, making sure everything was secure for the night. "Just remembering," Willa said. She held up the handkerchief. "Look at this. 12 years old and still intact." Franklin took it gently, examining his own clumsy stitches alongside Willa's perfect ones. "Now we match forever. I meant that, every word." "I know you did, and we do. Match, I mean, in every way that matters." Willa moved to stand beside him, looking down at the handkerchief. "Sometimes I think about that girl I was, traveling alone to Kingston to care for her aunt. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that one dusty afternoon would change her entire life. You think she would have done anything differently if she'd known? Not a single thing. I'd live through all of it again, every moment, to end up here with you." Willa looked up at her husband, at the silver starting to thread through his dark hair, at the lines time had carved into his face. He was no longer the young Marshal who'd ridden to her rescue, but the man he'd become was even better. Deeper, richer, more fully himself. "I love you, Willa Preston," Franklin said. "More than words can say." "Show me then," Willa said, and pulled him into a kiss. The years continued their steady march. Thomas left home in 1893 at age 17 to learn horse trading from a breeder in Colorado, though he promised to return to the ranch eventually. His departure left a hole in the family, but Willa knew it was necessary. Children had to fly on their own to discover who they were meant to be. Caroline surprised everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to go to a proper art school in San Francisco. It took some doing, finding a respectable boarding situation and enough money for tuition, but Franklin was determined his daughter would have the chance to develop her talents. She left in the spring of 1894, and Willa cried for 3 days straight. "They're supposed to leave," Franklin reminded her, holding her while she wept. "We raised them to be independent, to follow their dreams. We can't keep them children forever." "I know," Willa sobbed. "But knowing it and accepting it are two different things." William and Sarah were still home, William helping full-time on the ranch now that Thomas was gone, Sarah continuing her schooling and her music. The house felt emptier, though, and Willa found herself missing the chaos of having all 4 children under one roof. But there were compensations. With fewer demands on their time, Willa and Franklin rediscovered the pleasure of just being together. They took long rides through the mountains, sometimes camping overnight like they were courting again. They had dinners together without interruption, conversations that wandered through topics without little voices demanding attention. They remembered what it was like to be just Franklin and Willa before they'd become Mama and Papa. In 1896, Thomas returned home with a bride, a sweet girl named Anna he'd met in Colorado. They held a wedding on the ranch, a joyful celebration that brought Caroline home from San Francisco and drew friends from all over the territory. Watching Thomas marry reminded Willa so powerfully of her own wedding day that she found herself teary-eyed through the entire ceremony. "What's wrong?" Franklin whispered, seeing her tears. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. He's happy, Franklin. Our boy found someone who makes him happy, just like we found each other." Franklin squeezed her hand. The circle continues. Thomas and Anna built a small house on the ranch property, and Thomas took over much of the day-to-day operations, letting Franklin step back a bit. It was a gradual transition, father to son, but a natural one. Franklin was 52 now, and while still strong and capable, he was ready to let the younger generation carry more of the burden. Caroline finished her schooling in 1897 and moved to Denver, where she'd gotten a position designing sets and costumes for a theater company. She wrote long letters home describing the exciting life she was living, and Willa read them with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. Her daughter had flown far indeed. William married in 1898 to a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a practical girl named Ruth, who fit seamlessly into ranch life. Sarah was still at home, but she'd started teaching music lessons to children in town and talking about opening a proper music school. As the new century approached, Willa and Franklin found themselves in the strange position of being grandparents. Thomas and Anna had a daughter in 1897, naming her Josephine after Willa's beloved aunt, and another baby was on the way. William and Ruth were also expecting their first child. "Grandparents," Franklin said one evening, shaking his head in amused disbelief. "How did we get old enough to be grandparents? I have no idea," Willa said. She was 53 now, her hair more silver than brown, her face marked with the lines of a life fully lived. "But I don't feel old." "Do you?" "Not when I'm with you. You make me feel like that young Marshal again, seeing a brave woman with a rifle in her wagon and losing my heart in an instant." "Flatterer. Truth-teller." Franklin pulled her close. "You're just as beautiful now as you were then." "More so, because now I know every inch of you inside and out. I know your strength and your kindness and your courage. I know how you love our children and how you've built this life with me. Beauty at 22 is just genetics. Beauty at 53 is earned." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, he could still make her cry with his words. "I love you, Franklin Preston. And I love you, Willa Preston, now and always." The 20th century dawned with celebration throughout Kingston and the nation. There was talk everywhere about the modern age, about the changes coming, about the future spreading before them full of possibility. Willa and Franklin attended the town's New Year's celebration, watching the fireworks light up the night sky and listening to speeches about progress and prosperity. But later, at home on their ranch, they stood on their porch and looked out at the land they'd built their life on. The modern age could come, the world could change, but this would always be theirs. This land, this love, this life they'd created together. "You remember what I told you once?" Franklin asked. "About dreaming of a time when the territory would be tame enough we wouldn't need marshals. I remember. We're there, Willa. Not perfect, not completely civilized, but we're there. New Mexico will be a state soon, mark my words. The Wild West is becoming something else, something calmer and more settled." "Is that a good thing?" Willa asked. Franklin thought about it. "I think so. It means our grandchildren will grow up in a safer world, but I'm also glad I got to live through the wild part. It gave me you." Willa leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. 22 years of marriage, and she loved him more now than she had on their wedding day. That younger love had been real and true, but this love was deeper, tested by time and trials and triumph. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" she said. "The best, and we're not done yet. I plan on at least 30 more years with you, Mrs. Preston." "Only 30, I was thinking 40, Franklin laughed, the sound echoing out into the night. "40 it is then. We'll celebrate our 62nd anniversary together. It's a deal." They stood together watching the stars, the same stars that had watched over them from the beginning. The land stretched out before them, peaceful and familiar. Inside the house, the clock chimed midnight. A new century had begun, but some things remained constant. Love, family, home, the promise of forever, embroidered in blue thread and kept in every beat of their hearts. As spring arrived in 1900, the Preston Ranch was busier than ever. William and Ruth's son was born in March, a healthy boy they named Franklin after his grandfather. Thomas and Anna welcomed their second child, a boy they called Henry, in April. The house rang with the cries of infants and the laughter of family gathered together. Aunt Josephine, now in her 80s, delighted in the great-grandchildren. She spent hours rocking them and telling them stories, passing on family history to a new generation. Her health was failing, though, and everyone knew they wouldn't have her much longer. She passed peacefully in her sleep in June, surrounded by people who loved her. Willa wept for days, mourning the woman who'd been more than an aunt, who'd been a second mother and a dear friend. It was Josephine who'd brought Willa to Kingston in the first place, who'd been there when she married Franklin, who'd helped with all 4 children. The ranch felt emptier without her presence, but life continued, as it always does. Sarah married in the fall to a banker from town, a good man who appreciated her musical gifts. Caroline came home for the wedding, bringing a young man she was courting, an artist like herself. The family gathered together, multiple generations now, and Willa looked around at all the faces and felt overwhelming gratitude. This was what she and Franklin had built. Not just the ranch, not just the buildings and the land, but this family, this legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. Their children and their children's children, all carrying forward the values they'd tried to instill of hard work and integrity and kindness. As the years rolled on into the new century, Willa and Franklin settled into the peaceful rhythm of their later years. They still worked, but at their own pace. They spent long mornings over coffee, talking about everything and nothing. They took afternoon naps and evening walks. They read books together and played with their grandchildren and watched sunsets from their porch. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Thomas and Anna, with their 3 children now. William and Ruth, with 4. Caroline, married to her artist and living in Denver, pregnant with her first. Sarah and her husband with twin daughters. The ranch house overflowed with people and noise and joy. That evening, when everyone had finally departed or gone to bed, Willa and Franklin found themselves alone again on their porch. It had become their spot, this porch, the place where they reconnected and remembered and dreamed. 30 years, Franklin said, taking Willa's hand. Seems like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Sometimes I'm still that girl of 22 seeing you ride up on your black horse. Sometimes I'm this grandmother of 65, wondering where all the years went. Willa squeezed his hand. But I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the hard parts, especially not the hard parts. Those are what made us who we are. The droughts and the fires and the illnesses and the worries. We got through them together, and every challenge made us stronger. Franklin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I want you to know something, Willa. You've been the best part of my life. Everything good I am, everything I've accomplished, it's all because of you. You made me brave enough to leave behind my father's legacy and build my own. You gave me the family I always dreamed of. You've been my partner and my love and my best friend for 30 years, and I treasure every single day we've had together." Willa felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Oh, Franklin, you've given me just as much. You rescued me in every way a person can be rescued. You showed me what love really means. Not just the romantic part, but the daily choosing, the commitment, the staying when things get hard. You've been the most wonderful husband and father I could have imagined." They held each other close. Two people who'd started as strangers and become one heart, one soul, one life shared across 3 decades. The handkerchief with their intertwined initials was carefully preserved now, a family treasure that would be passed down through generations, a tangible symbol of a love story that had shaped so many lives. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. New Mexico finally achieved statehood in 1912, fulfilling Franklin's prediction. The Preston Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management. More grandchildren were born, growing the family even further. Caroline's theatrical career flourished, and her work was reviewed in newspapers across the country. Sarah opened her music school, teaching dozens of children over the years. Willa and Franklin grew older together gracefully, their hair silver, their steps slower, but their love undiminished. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1919, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. Franklin was 73, Willa 75, and they'd beaten Franklin's prediction of 40 more years by making it all the way through. One evening in the summer of 1920, they sat together on their beloved porch as the sun set in a blaze of glory. Franklin had slowed down considerably in recent months, his heart not as strong as it once was. But he insisted on their evening ritual, these moments together watching the day end. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the sunset. "Never gets old." "Nothing about this life with you has gotten old," Willa said. She held his hand, feeling how fragile it had become, the skin paper thin over prominent bones. "Not a single moment. Willa, I need to tell you something." Franklin turned to look at her, his brown eyes still warm and loving despite his body's failing. "If my time comes soon, and I think it might, I want you to know I have no regrets. Every choice I made led me to you, and that makes every choice right. You've been the love of my life, the center of my world, the reason for everything. Promise me you'll be all right when I'm gone." "Don't talk like that," Willa said, though she knew he spoke truth. She'd felt it too, the sense that their time together was drawing to a close. "You're going to be fine. Maybe. But if I'm not, promise me. Promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy, keep being the brave, strong woman I fell in love with." "I promise," Willa whispered. "But you have to promise me something too. Promise you won't leave me any sooner than you have to." "Stay as long as you can. Always," Franklin said. "In every way possible, always." Franklin passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, Willa holding his hand. He was 73 years old, and he'd lived a good, full, meaningful life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the respect and love the community had for him. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Franklin Preston, beloved husband and father." Willa mourned deeply, as one does when losing a part of themselves. But she kept her promise. She kept living, kept finding joy in her children and grandchildren, kept being strong. She ran the ranch with Thomas, played with great-grandchildren, attended weddings and births and all the markers of ongoing life. And every evening, she sat on the porch they'd shared and talked to Franklin as if he were still there. She told him about her day, about the children's accomplishments, about the way the sunset looked. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the light hit the mountains just so, she could almost feel his presence beside her, could almost hear his voice saying he loved her. She kept the handkerchief in her pocket always, pulling it out to touch the embroidered initials when she needed to feel close to him. Their initials, intertwined forever in blue thread. "Now we match forever," he'd said, and he'd been right. They did match, they always would, even though death had temporarily separated them. Willa lived another 5 years, surrounded by family who loved her and cared for her. She died in 1925 at the age of 80, peacefully and without pain. Her last words were, "I'm coming, Franklin. Wait for me." She was buried beside her husband on the hill overlooking the ranch. The headstone read, "Willa Preston, beloved wife and mother." And between the two headstones, Thomas placed a marker with their initials intertwined, just like on the handkerchief. FP and WS, together forever. The ranch continued through the generations, always in Preston hands, always carrying forward the legacy of love and hard work that Franklin and Willa had established. The handkerchief was carefully preserved, passed down as a family treasure, with the story told and retold of how a cowboy had added his love's initials to hers and declared they'd match forever. And they did. In the land they'd built together, in the family they'd raised, in the love that had sustained them through 42 years of marriage and beyond, they matched. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds in the Wild West, who'd built a life of meaning and purpose, who'd loved each other through every joy and sorrow, whose story would inspire generations to come. Their great-great-grandchildren would stand on that same porch and watch the same sunsets, would work the same land, would hold the same handkerchief, and marvel at the love story it represented. And in that way, Franklin and Willa Preston lived on, their love eternal, their match perfect, their story complete.